Hello everyone, today we talk about the tournaments in the heart of the Middle Ages, but from a relatively different standpoint from the one the topic is usually approached, that is to say, the intertwinement of the military dimension with these alleged games, especially in the era in which these were more developed and bloodier, right, compared to the later sort of normalization with the joust, with sort of many more regulations and a general still training, but also increasingly entertainment purposes that sort of detach them from the battlefield in a way also to, in fact, exorcise the decline of the same chivalry and knighthood in a strictly technical sense in the later Middle Ages. That are in fact the times from which we know, like the greatest, let's say, aesthetical aspect of the joust at that point, rather than the tournament itself that everybody's sort of more familiar with. And the strictly military aspect of the story naturally deserves, especially in the origins of the tournaments, in their traditional meaning, in how they were also at that level technically organized, would require so many other videos. We will not discuss that, but we will essentially approach some aspects of the wall as an introduction for those very future videos. So, in medieval times, when, say, tournaments began to be regularized and organized in a sort of more, at least from our perspective, familiarly recognizable fashion, people believed that these activities were a relatively new concept, at least in the way they had been modulated in more recent times. There is the notional name of Geoffroy de Pruy, who passed away in the same year of the Norman conquest of England, tributed with, in fact, the invention of the same tournaments, which is, of course, a way to say that these activities now, that also as we tend to know them better through second half 12th century epic chivalric literature, had been somehow stepping further in a more neatly enucleated way around that time. Of course, we know, as we were just premising, that some forms of collective training in the form of games that could, in fact, combine this more ruthlessly brutal to also as a collectively, communitarially entertaining dimension were quite old, right? Military leaders historically as consistently strived to replicate the conditions of warfare in their training sessions, just as they do today. The Romans, for example, implemented this in their tactical exercises, that the famous Flavius Josephus excerpt tells us being, according to them, in fact, just battles for which, as the famous battle from Flavius Josephus says, the same legionaries would regard battles as trainings like others, just in which they spilled a bit of blood, or a bit more blood to a degree. The ancient Germans arranged military contests that engaged the entire community. Tacitus famously highlights this aspect when discussing the Tencteri tribe, noting, quote, "Hic lusus infantum, haec juvenum aemulatio," that is to say, here lies the diversion of infancy, the rivalry of youth. In other words, these were initiatic rites, similar to the ones of the Comitatus war bands that even the Zippe owned, right, for their levy militias, and often, to some degree, this could be intertwined. I will not digress now on the Lugi and other references from Tacitus, but I made a video about the Germanic Comitatus just recently that explains what, in fact, this also passage into manhood, say here from infancy to youth, right, meant as virility, was really a as we know it from many other cultures, anthropologically speaking, like a traumatic one, a violent one in which these men were neatly selected. Tacitus does tell us that these exercises included making this naked youth running in a path of spears, with the delight of the chieftains observing this game and sort of betting who would actually survive out of them. And they were incredibly violent and traumatic events that literally were designed to achieve that level of, in fact, of death even, or at least of survival through consistent risk of death that actually was normal, right? We don't insist too much on this. I also recently made a video about the gladiatorial munera for the Romans that is the sort of further reflection of that, at least in the upgrading of that same concept. So all this was obviously aiming at conferring the community with some specific moral, even before physical capacity, that would be functional for military performance. Similar activities were acknowledged during the migration era at the court of Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king and protagonist of some of the greatest sagas of the Germanic peoples. And Isidore of Seville, the greatest early medieval Iberian author, remarked that the same Visigoths partook in daily mock battles and military competitions. All right, let's stress that the Goths in particular were considered as the finest equestrians among the Germans, which the same Franks would still, by courtesy, recognize when sort of Visigothic kingdom did not quite exist anymore. The same actually towards the Longobards that, as we know from some sources, practiced this game that is similar to the later Quintain, by which they were to trust with their cavalry spear while, in fact, running, right, while riding at speed, hanging from tree leaves, and then eventually, because of some, initiatic rites of the ancient brotherhood of warriors, they would have to eat. All right, as like remember killing the snake, the image of Saint George. I just made a video about the origin of that iconography in 3rd century BC Europe, right, from an Indo-European standpoint. The imperial biographer Einhard documented that Charlemagne's sons retained Frankish customs by participating in riding drills and practicing weapon techniques, with Charlemagne himself relishing riding and hunting, affirming that, quote, no one matches the Franks in these arts. The connection with hunting is crucial, as we've seen also in the aforementioned video about the fact, like the knight, not much slaying another knight, and opposite of that, but metaphorically, like the darker part of the soul that is symbolized by the serpents, and still mirroring this broader aristocratic sport that hunting really was, and that fundamentally warfare did not differ from. Still, up to the 18th century, war was essentially a royal sport, properly considered as such, even in the largest engagements. So you understand, from the Roman Epica Gymnasia to the various Germanic practices that we will see better also now existing in some parts of Europe, especially like to be documented in the same Germany up to like the year 1000 and beyond. There was a shared, right, European military training practice that at large we do not know too much about. We know that these were all essentially military cultures, but we it was so normal for them. This is really the point, that also through very cursory knowledge of the same Carolingian chronicles and historiography, it was really useful for them to provide information about. Hell, even for war, like, wasn't this great need of saying that yes, every single year the Franks would actually carry out their campaigns. We do not have practically any possibility to reconstruct even Carolingian battles for this reason, with the only exception of the one of Zuntal, which was also one of the few times the Carolingians themselves were defeated. And the more notable things that the same scribes would note in their monastic scriptoria was, this year there was no military campaign, right? Not even just saying for other years that there had been, because it was so normal that there was no need really to even point that out. This goes in parallel, of course, with our content on medieval knighthood, also as far as the fact that much research and interesting military techniques of these horsemen during the centuries, especially these ones, when in fact what we know as probably the Carolingian one was in theory, right, would expand to be fundamentally the Western European one in a few centuries, and that we have to make the effort of trying to understand from the perspective of those who practiced itself, for which, for example, literary activity was considered effeminated, right, and so not proper to those who bore the cingulum militaris. Amid the dispute between the sons of Louis the Pious, military exercises and group games occurred among the Franks after the notable oaths of Strasbourg on February the 14th, 842. This is extremely interesting because, as you know, this event took place essentially as almost like in the presence of the armies of Western and Eastern Francia that could have theoretically also clashed with one another, and instead negotiated this alliance against Lothair. And we do have, in fact, extensive evidence throughout the rest of the Middle Ages that these large gatherings of troops were always like a good excuse to enact these training. In fact, with this chance where you had so many warriors present, so much so that even in the heart of the Middle Ages, when, for example, tactics were mostly about in-depth battle lines and battlefields stretched for kilometers, and you literally had to wait this battle line to slowly advance, like to reach the enemy at some point and fighting or whatever, in order to kill the time and the tension, the knights would have their own newly, in fact, knighted squires and other individuals actually fighting in front of the ranks, like just playing tournaments, and so to get in tune with the other fighters and possibly even fighting later if they hadn't been enough exhausted, telling you how sort of natural it was to live up to certain standards. Like there were knights participating to tournaments even at 80 years old. But we're talking, I'm much more fascinated with the high Middle Ages side of the story than the later one, right? And it's not banal because, again, these exercises, as we'll see, were akin real battles, even as far as the risk and the actual killing. So regardless of the various conventions that can be enacted and the political motivations for which these men had to beat one another, still these were pretty serious and extensions, let's say, of the broader imperial Catholic manifestation of power through the Holy Ghost, that is, the winged glory. These cavalry games were often conducted, just to go back to Carolingian times, by the forces of Louis the German, that made a video on, and Charles the Bald, also Baldwin, of course, likely in Worms, for training purposes, right? You see, you have this also specific centers like Strasbourg, Worms, that could logistically serve, in fact, entire armies, right? If you look at the various German diets, these were, especially on the occasion of the royal elections, veritable gatherings of an enormous amount of knights, right? The sources sometimes inflate the number, but if you consider like the plausible scale of thousands of knights, you realize just how much of a fortune, by the way, these guys would spend in the local place, and what these were some of the most important cities to begin with, because also in times of actual war they could supply armies of this size. Positioned in front of crowds on either side of a designated field, equal numbers of Saxons, Gascons, Austrasians, and Bretons charged each other full speed, mimicking a battle scenario in the aforementioned meeting. And just prior to collision, one side would pivot to simulate a retreat from their pursuers while using their shields for defense. Subsequently, the fugitives, so to say, would launch a counteroffensive against those pursuing them. And this is very interesting because we look at these engagements between Louis the German and Charles the Bald's forces. You realize that here the so-called feigned flight is at play, albeit it's a slightly different thing. I mean, feigned flights did exist, but they were more often than not real flights, meaning that if you need to give ground with, say, the best of your men, like in a battle line that has technically to frontally smash inside the enemy, because that's the only reason for which it's designed, you will essentially give ground in a like allowing the enemy fundamentally to losing cohesion, or at least trying to maintain that, but still giving an edge to the enemy. And so the greatest ability in this training, which shows that these tactics were enacted, was at some point, in fact, to turn to will to twice, right, to essentially first give ground and then to recounter the enemy. And this would naturally take the same dynamic that, in fact, the stronger and the weaker sides would dictate accordingly. And so ultimately both young princes at Strasbourg participated in the game, spurred by the enthusiastic cheers from the onlookers, because this was eventually also an elite of some sort. Naturally, there were other troops, not just the horsemen, right? These were just increasingly prominent, of course, in Carolingian warfare and still the upper arm since the mid-6th century in Europe. Armed with lances, the young princes initially charged one group and then switched to another group, acting as though they were retreating. And this was also, as you know, an occasion in which, in fact, the west and the east of the Frankish world would sort of confront with one another. The Oath of Strasbourg is, in fact, sworn by, both, as you know, both in Old French and in Old German, in a way that really reflects the gradual partition of these two major areas of Europe that would be technically also in the later Middle Ages like the most famous for the proper standards of chivalric quality. And we will talk more about this in a while. These mock battles bore little resemblance to the tournaments of the 11th and 12th centuries, right? They were ever less regulated. The lances were held lightly and not meant for powerful strikes. This was just inherent in the military means of the times. And don't think that, in fact, a 9th century Carolingian horseman was that different in the essentials of his panoply from, say, a 13th century knight. Yes, things have been enhanced. There is more power involved. There is especially more collective training. But don't think that these sort of more mock battles were anything that, less brutal than, in fact, especially the later tournaments as a whole. There was much more of a straightforward, like if you get killed into this, you sort of deserve that. Kind of full imperial Catholic works virtue belief. Now, the engagements, however, were conceptualized differently as well from, again, what we will see now in the 11th and the 12th century. There was this sense of this emphasis on maneuver, right? Because the migration era had left still this idea that there is, first of all, more, let's say, individual capacity. Here there are also, it depends on the numbers. There is a huge dispute, as you know, about the size, for example, of the Carolingian army, and even more here how many of those horsemen would participate in these clashes. But everything was sort of still much less, regulated, disciplined, as the later, sort of increasingly professional feudal knights would really become. So there was a much greater emphasis on this sort of chasing the enemy, being pushed back, and in a much more fluid fashion that would become even possible in later times. And there was also, of course, a greater capacity of the individual element to distinguish himself more easily. Warriors from the same region practiced together. We know that from the time they would engage in both offensive and defensive strategies, as we were pointing out. A summary of Vegetius' writings on Roman warfare, that was practically the only military theory from the classical era in the West, also because there was really no need here to simply replicate what happened in antiquity. This would have been actually more plausible in these times than for the Renaissance, where that was even ever overtly emphasized. But again, this was a time which, of course, also in antiquity, like military theories were more like anecdotal, say, notions for some general formation, say, for some general education from leaders that would have, in any case, as always, like gotten the necessary competence and expertise of command through actual military service, through actual command of armies and campaigns in battle. And here, as we were saying before, it's basically the same thing, right? It's not like the Carolingians needed to write down how to make warfare, or any other people at this time needed really to. But of course, there is a level of civilizations by which Roman history and warfare is studied already. It had always been. And we have we were talking about the summary, right, of Vegetius compiled by Rabanus Maurus for King Lothar II, indicating that such training drills were prevalent among the Franks, to the point of being sort of even described as also a matter of broader ideological and political propaganda, highlighting the significance of horsemanship, for sure, in their military culture. Because, of course, in Vegetius' times, the Roman army was not cavalry focused, right? Infantry was still, at that point, the queen of battles. But, of course, this is why also these peoples across eras were toying with different ideas, also imitating their predecessors by criticizing and deepening their knowledge of military history as well. Over 50 years after Nithard, the Council of Tribur that we were mentioning recently in that video about German history noted that pagan games still existed, and sometimes resulting in fatalities. This is incredibly fascinating because we're talking, especially in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, of course, of a longer permanence of these military trainings down the line, because, say, feudalism has more difficulties to kick in, and so still sort of average people participate in these games as well at at a village level or whatever. Of course, cavalry was already central. Like the Germans had already lost, like for quite a while, the preeminence of the average of the infantry forces over cavalry, and there was a general difficulty in recently as fully evangelized Eastern Frankish kingdom to simply eradicate certain practice that could be even still useful, regardless of the different religious, say, inclination, let's say, in origin, for the the organization of the local military. Of course, the nobility was trying ever more to disarm the people, like to make them work in order to foster this more elite professional element of armored mounted troops, which was also like a necessity from the side of the same peasantry. In any case, we see that the Saxons, the Thuringians, so these northern Germans, more sort of distant from the civilized parts of the country historically, beginning to adopt the military practices of the Franks, but throughout the 10th, the 11th centuries, right? You can argue that at the beginning of the Salian dynasty still there was some more sort of traditional way of war in the north that mostly focused on a higher amount of infantry in general, that was still presumably more focused on individual, or at least emphasizing individual combat, like this sort of idea of championship. Naturally, also the more developed parts of Germany had gone beyond, were sort of ever more cavalry based and with a greater degree of collective training. And this is a bit the same difference you can see across, say, Europe, going further north with the Jutland or Scandinavia. You realize that, of course, those peoples were exactly like, again, the more north you go, in the late Viking era, you have important cavalry contingents. That's been too much understated for the Norse, but indeed, like, they don't have anything that matches the qualities of continental, cavalry standards, and they largely still fight with the phalanxes you can see even among the insular Saxons, etc. Again, I made so many videos on these topics. We'll come back on them, so that's not exactly what we're talking about today, but it's important also to give always this perspective, because differences did matter and they weren't random, right? And there is an actual value of merit in the inferiority and superiority of the systems. Although foot soldiers had traditionally been this northern German's primary force, they started integrating cavalry in a more consistent fashion, which adapted swiftly also to this evolving style of warfare. Again, it's not like the Saxons just fought as infantrymen. They had their cavalry, but there was a sort of tipping point by which it would have been easier or even just almost mandatory from a political and social standard for the cavalry to dismount, because since antiquity, like in this more sedentary part of the world, like the idea that you could simply escape, like, because when you were mounted, would concern those who were fighting on foot. We've seen it, just to come back on a battlefield we mentioned before, the Battle of Argentoratum, Battle of Strasbourg, which Julian defeats the Alemanni, witnesses this. Like the Alemanni infantry taunted the cavalry to dismount, because they thought that it could be abandoned by the elite, thus would have profited from the weakening, the slaughter of the commoners, and increased further power. This is what had, however, already started happening during the migration era, and would continue going on throughout all these centuries, in fact, towards a more feudal system that in Germany at least fully kicks in the second half of the 12th century, at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, after the Western Frankish model. Both Henry the Fowler and Otto the Great, the famous Saxon leaders of the 10th century, earned accolades from their biographers for their military training and equestrian abilities. I made multiple videos about the Ottonian army organization and campaigns, and we've seen how already crucial cavalry really was. Just the other day I was making a video about Liutprand of Cremona and how, this Italian subject of Otto I would stress like the importance of the militas, mounted troops, regardless also the important Lombard infantry development already at that point, also for exquisitely political and ideological reasons. The idea that these northern conquerors were already fostering some sort of more definitely feudal symbolism, whereby like the elite owned everything and the commoners mostly had nothing. And so you have also to adapt your view on the basis of a critical understanding of, what this author said, regardless of what, for example, at the local level the reality was. Henry the Fowler was particularly noted for excelling in military exercises. I mean, the reason why we call him falconer is also in part this, that as we said before, through hunting, there was a great deal of horse riding, this idea that through the eagle, that, as you know, is the symbol of the Holy Ghost of victory from the steppes, etc. Like, you can dominate better the world. You have this projection of the properly of the bird of God that can look at him, at the sun, straight in the eyes. When in parallel with, in fact, the build-up of the Saxon military that would eventually hegemonize the Eastern Frankish kingdom and repristinate the empire with attachment of the Italic one into this axis, right? And it was reported that, quote, Henry the Fowler, that in exercitis quoque ludi tanta eminentia superabat omnes ut terrorem ceteris ostentaret. That is to say, that Henry was so better, basically, than anybody else in these games, in this ludi, that he surpassed basically everybody else, and other people would even be terrorized by such display of individual capacity. Next, of course, also to the collective one that these games also entail. We also know that Otto I, his son, regularly engaged in horseback riding. In general, aside from, of course, like his military exploit that are sort of more famous. Think about how both father and son defeated the Magyars. In fact, like in relatively asymmetrical conditions, right? Not that actually the Frankish system was inferior to the Hungarian one, quite the contrary, but it required all a specific technicality and strategy and tactics to deal with, and this was mostly based on equestrian skills in terms of command primarily, but also from an individual point of view. In Tournai, the Burgrave Evrardus led a group of courageous knights. Henry III, the Count of Louvain, 1050-1095, challenged one of his adversaries from an opposing faction to a personal duel in the lists. This was also a thing, like trying to get like this sport again, triggered by personal feuds and other conflicts, down to okay, it's between you and me. It's a personal thing, because the Imperium was meant to, in fact, proceed from God to the troops through these media that the sacred rulers really were, right? And equestriansmanship and knighthood were all one with it, right? So that if you won or lost, this would dictate basically the outcome of the war. So in a very ideally heroic, quasi-Homeric fashion. After much convincing, Jocelyn of Forst accepted the invitation and, upon lowering his legs, urged his horse forward with intensity, aiming to unseat the Count of Louvain. Tragically, his strike hit the Count in the heart, resulting in his immediate death. Of course, the symbolism here is equally important. If you strike someone in the heart, it's not simply, okay, well, that happened, like a modern secular mindset would think. Like this, regardless of the veridicity here, first of all, there is a technical, even just if you want to stick to the material, technical side of the story, like striking somebody in the heart from horseback is, you must aim for it. And secondly, of course, there is a broader symbology in, of course, the heart as the center, like the spirit of the man. And so if you're able to essentially trust him through the heart, you will kill him in that complete fashion, in that sense of, again, of complete superiority from your side that mirrors this. The Counts of Flanders organized tournaments to distract their knights from the private wars that were undermining peace with the country, simultaneously providing a chance for them to hone their skills. This was also one of the generally regulatory meanings and tendencies of tournaments, right? So that was all a gradual, let's say, affirmation of the same based on the level of political obedience and collective discipline you could impose as a ruler. The Counts of Flanders were very powerful lords. I made a video about the County of Flanders and sort of many others, let's say, taking place in the same in the same region. And as you know, this land will become also later quite famous for its feudal culture, at least in the Burgundian period. As you know, that some of these cities will become the center of some of the most famous, important tournaments in Europe, right? So it was a long-standing tradition. After re-establishing order in his realm, for example, Baldwin VII, Flanders sought experience in military matters as abroad as well. His successor, Charles the Good, upheld this tradition by leading 200 knights to various tournaments in regions like France and Normandy that were, in fact, all won with, say, very close, at least with the County of Flanders. It was technically part of the Western Frankish Kingdom. As you know, like, there was a great military cooperation historically. The same invasion of Anglo-Danish England by William, Duke of Normandy, witnessed the presence of large amounts of Flemish, of Bretons, the latter also known for this more primitive and outdated but still effective in French areas, sort of Celtic hit-and-run cavalry tactics that would have eventually, that had by that point already schooled actually the Normans into the sophistications, in fact, as we've seen before also, feint flights and more, like if this was ever used for real at Hastings, as the stories put it, it's really all very relevant, right? And we do know that northern France and southern England would become the cradle of some of the single most exquisitely pure feudal culture in Europe, from which essentially most of what we know European feudalism would stem from, right? Especially, in fact, in the 11th and the 12th century, after the Norman conquest in particular, but the same Gothic concept, right, of these great cathedrals of symbolizing the universe, like we're all one with this type of imperial ambition that we noticed, like, was very much there in the hearts of the same Lionheart, for example, and really expressed by the flower of French cavalry. It was deemed, with good reason, to be the best in the world, right? And much of this still owed to that sense of warband, air-ring lifestyle, that level of hosting and feudal courtesy and favors in terms of actual military contribution between lords and vassals. And so the tournament fully blended in this kind of context. As a devout individual, Charles the Good aimed to atone for any wrongdoings from these activities through generous contributions to the church that, as we will see now, had also already started to regulate itself, like the general behavior of the secular knights. Think about the peaces and the truces of God. In part, the tournaments corresponded to the same, in the lay hierarchy, to the same process of regulation, right? Kingdoms building was happening through the monarchy and the church combined, and organizing tournaments was a good way to sort of frame, even just from a mindset point of view, these very often were ruthlessly violent and fiercely indisciplined barons, really. So even like the recognized leaders as primi inter pares, within that sense of, again, there is something bigger than this. There's an imperial Catholic dimension that you have to partake in order to reunite the world into divine standards. Hence also the crusade expansionism, the saving of the of the Holy Citadel. It's all part of, by the way, all the legends, all the memories of the in fact the veritable cults connected with the brotherhoods of warriors that indoctrinated themselves into that kind of holy war. Following the First Crusade, the clergy continued to strongly oppose tournaments, similar to their views on private warfare, considering both as reckless squandering of resources and lives. And it's not like they were wrong about this. I mean, the tournaments, as we just said, had been established by the same lay authorities to create more order, but there was so much they could do in practice. The church was often militarized, but they didn't have all the power that the laymen had. Like sometimes they came from, especially in this war, from the same families, so everybody knew what the system was like. But aside from the fact that for this reason the church tended to suffer more from the distractions of these mock battles that were as other battles. In fact, the latter point is focal. That is to say, why exercising in this way when you can fundamentally go out there and fight against the infidels rather, and still tournaments were a way to regulate feuds that did not have to exist, and that the church was relentlessly working in order, in fact, to sanate and to compact Christendom for a more coordinated, in fact disciplined channeling of this enormous force that the West was having now against the enemies of the faith. The clergy contended that knights could better showcase their martial prowess against Islam in the Holy Land. It was absolutely correct. That's also why, say, Bernard of Clairvaux reinforces the principle of the new militia, the fact that there was a divine standard in certain knights that surpassed essentially the more secular lifestyle, and that fundamentally would bring them to a purer, more originally ancestral and sacred way of war. Right, that was the same concept. Again, holy war was shared at all times by every single people in the world. Like I still have followers that literally don't know this. They think that the concept of holy war was invented by at the time of the Crusades or by Christians, and they of course have absolutely no understanding of the entire concept of the imperial Catholic tradition even before Christian times. And in fact, just the fact that I say this really make their brain tilt. But there is a very and deeply sacred spiritual training, almost an esoteric one, very much connected, as you know, with the Ghibelline set ideology, set about is even properly doctrine, that was all one with the contention with the church that was to regulate this further, but also clash during the investiture controversy regarding who had to decide what exactly, whose leadership that was. That's why, for example, I don't know, Godfrey of Bouillon wouldn't accept papal legates to dictate rule in Jerusalem. You can argue that those Frankish peoples in the north were sort of more originally attached to the sense that the Cingulum Militaris would bring with itself like a sort of spiritual dominance even over the clergy. That was, of course, always the contentious issue here, given that essentially the paradigm shift in late antiquity had brought, if anything, to the separation of church and state, regardless of what people have been brainwashed into thinking that it's just like a just a contemporary thing. No, that's called enforcing, atheism in culture. That has nothing to do with the separation of church and state. That is evangelically foundational, right? And so the problem there is that there was always some degree of church regulation. In fact, mostly like all these peoples, like as we just said, worked always in tandem with the church and the empire, that never and could never disconfess one another constitutionally. Like it would be an anti-traditional concept. Now, in 1130, the Council of Clermont banned tournaments due to the fatalities they caused, declaring even that those who perished in them were denied Christian burial. And this is also not wrong. I mean, we have often discussed and some of you has also further asked me, like, what is self-sacrifice in holy combat that the entire traditional Catholic Indo-European doctrine is founded on, and beyond. Like, this is not just, I don't know, stepping on a mine and blowing up until you go to heaven. That's absolutely not the case. It's not the way you materially die. It's the level of spiritual predisposition in achieving the transcendence of your mortality, in voluntarily unleashing the most infernal forces within you to tame them, to transfigure your soul from a terrifying demon into the angelic woman of chivalry that will bring you to heaven with her winged glory, that she technically is the same, so that you can partake divinity as well. And so, indeed, if you died in a tournament, that is not really a good indicator of any particular effort of winning the world and taking over the universe, conquering the empire, lording over all the earth. It just means that you were essentially not enough to a degree, and it's not like you wouldn't have any kind of value by dying like that. But it was an increasing effort to maintain the standards of military directed towards, in fact, a truly Catholic direction for taking over the world. That, of course, the tournament per se could contribute to as a form of training, but that often, especially at this point, was mostly a matter of, quarrels with someone and, struggle over patrimonial, dynastic issues, etc. Knights held a different view, of course, for this reason. They saw tournaments as practical occasions. They understood the problem. Like, if you died in them, it was not definitely a particularly positive thing, right? You would like at least to die in a major battle, hopefully in the Holy Land, or at least in some clash that was blessed by God and by the same church. I mean, there were lots, as you know, of crusades. I mean, even technically the conquest of England was a crusade, as you know. We tend to, again, sclerotize our idea of crusade simply on the basis of, the canonic expeditions to Levant, but it was, holy war was everywhere, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if tournaments themselves had partially, in fact, contained some of this, even at some point with some blessing from the local clergy as well. If anything, these councils did not mean that the entire Christendom would simply obey to their conclusions, like things would fundamentally only gradually sit in. And so knights would see the tournament primarily as training, but also recreation, profit, mingling with their fellow noblemen. Again, they were just a great moment of public display of power of their houses, their families, chances to sort of elevate their own status, and more, because there would be also poorer horsemen. At this point, knighthood hasn't even been properly and fully technically locked into, okay, this is actually what a knight is, as opposed to any other guy who's fighting on horseback, meaning without even nobiliar ancestry. Alright, things would end in fact in a generation in that direction of, instead, a much stricter definition with dubbing, but not even at that point it was so fully explained. Now, the most notable accomplishment of a knight could be presented to a noblewoman, something not achievable on the battlefield, for example. That's yet another great reason, not just the sexual motivation for combat, for the Imperial Catholic Empire itself, but the fact that technically, yes, despite of the fact that women often attended in different times of history battles, as a spectacle up to the 19th century, dames would do that, etc. We'll talk about this in some video, but in the Middle Ages, essentially, especially the type of women that you needed on the battlefield weren't quite there. So for you to simply show off. It was incredibly important to fully express your virility in that way. I partly explained also again the erotic meaning of the tournament as a meeting occasion. There are some specific symbolism hinting at that. Also, as far as the dames, clothing and the idea that this could be blood by their own knight's stain. So there are many obvious allusions there. And so, regardless of what the church said, it was again well said and did have an influence on it as well. Neither the clergy denunciations nor the church's rulings specifically dissuaded knights from this kind of tournaments. And again, there were also miserable realities, because how many, again, people with broken spines would get from this? Like, they were really incredibly dangerous and vicious events. And that's how, again, they had been born. Remember the initial Romano-Germanic mechanisms? They were designed to kill people, fundamentally, so that the others would be emboldened, stiffened, and sort of reinvigorated by this blood spilling, and the survivors would have hopefully really gained that level of capacity that would make them understand what war technically is, what dying actually is. Now, prominent religious leaders at the time openly condemned tournaments. The same Bernard of Clairvaux, so in the Laude de Nova Militia, urged also Suger to embrace the sword of the Spirit, the word of God, against these accursed gatherings. These Nundine, which Robert, the king's brother, and Henry, son of the Count of Champagne, so we're talking about the top nobility of Europe, wished to organize after Easter. Because the sense was that you would spring out, like with the rebooting of the year in spring, as in fact the Phoebus Apollo that restarts a cycle, the Aetas, right, that molds the world in his own image through military campaigns in this very displays of imperial power. These lords had recently returned from the Holy Land, by the way, and were eager to set up a tournament in order to display the military experience that they had acquired on their Outremer campaigns. One of Saint Bernard's biographers claimed that those who died in these contests would surely go to hell, for the same reason that we expressed before. There was nothing self-sacrificial about the tournament just per se, also as a greater political and strategic enterprise, right? It was not a fight against the forces of darkness, if not at a level that was evidently lower, when there were so many greater issues going on in Christendom and outside of it to counter, like a true knight would, as a sacred warrior. James of Vitry described the rival champions at tournaments as driven by negative feelings such as jealousy, also inflicting brutal injuries upon one another, so really wasting also this youth, this noble blood, for such petty issues that were, however, in perspective, like what was gradually structuring also the local seigneuries. Like, these rivalries were mirroring the sort of built up of stronger principalities that had ever greater ambitions at a territorial level, and that could eventually foster further power, which is also one of the reasons why, for example, the Crusades were not so particularly participated, considering especially the enormous potential that Europe really had at the time. In these tournaments, the winner would claim the defeated's horse and armor as well, which in this early eras is a incredibly more important thing, because it's not just that a war horse and full panoply cost an enormity. It's an equivalent of a private jet, like in comparison, right? it's been estimated really like that. So it was definitely a very good prize to fight for. But they were incredible. They were reflecting, like, per se as such, an entire seigneuries, right? In order to feed a warhorse, to train on it, to purchase, to buy and produce an armor like that, you would have to have, in fact, just a seigneurial scale wealth. And so if you lost that technical equipment, you would lose just so much from a patrimonial standpoint, and the entire world revolved around your own knightly training, your spiritual indoctrination. All the system looked at you and said, okay, so show what you're capable of doing, accept that you can always also improve yourself, show that you can contribute to the world's salvation, just as we workers do that, like breaking our backs in the fields, or we priests do by a lifetime of contemplation and abstinence and spiritual regulation. So you understand how this would be the equivalent, even when not literally happening during the tournaments that were fought over somebody else's property, would result in substantial losses and devastating entire harvests. Even just going to a tournament as a travel, as a journey, entailed that you had to feed your war horse, you had to provide particular provisions that had to be paid by someone in a way or another. Lords imposed heavy taxes on their subjects to fund these extravagant events, while the aftermath was often marred by vice. At the same time, regardless, of course, of the conflict that existed with the other estates, like, the system did work fine the way it did. Again, these tournaments were really functional in order to increase and to keep up, like, the general quality of Western cavalry. Humbert de Roman made a video about him, presented, in fact, a more nuanced critique. Like, he acknowledged, for example, that while tournaments should be banned due to the dangers they pose to both life and morality, resulting in the deaths of combatants, because that was actually the case, they also held certain benefits. Roman contended that while some practices were worthy of condemnation, others could be deemed acceptable. Humbert pointed out the issues of extravagant spending that adversely affected the knights and their families, driven by pride and a yearning for honors, meant so to portray themselves as brave and noble. This is a rhetoric really sounding much later in time. We read so many excerpts of later literature criticizing the sense of glory of nobility. They're I would say creepy to a degree, like more too moralistic, at least in the measure in which they became increasingly satirical rather than actually, reflecting, like in these times, in a more traditional ways. More seriously, Roman noted that some noblemen used tournaments as a pretext to settle personal vendettas, flouting the rules of competition and humiliating the adversary. So definitely an anti-Catholic concept in the truest imperial essence of its meaning. Additionally, there was a tendency for some to engage with unsavory women post-tournament. So this was also seen as a deflection from marital duties to begin with, and the general and tendency towards chastity that a knight had to at least be able to master for higher purpose, including breeding a race of new, like, again, these were very interesting psychophysical human specimens, and so there was much to this enduring capacity, reflecting the quality of a being that didn't have to be corrupted, right? So involving the race in the process. Consequently, three specific behaviors were worthy of criticism: extravagance stemming from foolish expenditure, a desire for vanity, and malevolent intentions in combat. However, getting to the good aspects, if a knight intended to fight in the name of God, he could participate in legitimate contests to enhance his fighting abilities, as practice is crucial in mastering warfare. So if this was out of, fair competition, think about even today's sports, like why do people compete in sports? Of course, there are the single most twisted ideologies behind that, as we can see in the last year. Fortunately, things are reverting to at least towards a normal direction. The sense is that, as long as it was pure training, it was kind of fine, right? In tournaments, knights also inspired one another. It wasn't much just a matter of technical skills. It was about belonging to a group that would spirit you, that would share the Holy Ghost with you in the military enterprise. And so the knightly earthly pursuits for glory could also be devoted to the noble cause of combating the Saracens through the same tournament training. And there was also bad people within the same Christendom that had to be kept at bay, right? Moral and corrupt individuals termed ribauds, and other nefarious characters could be kept at bay, had to be kept at bay by the knights that did perform police function. Remember, here, I always say it when we talk about knights, but there is a strictly, elite dimension of what it means to be the top professional fighter around, right? These were troops designed to be able to slaughter hundreds of people in their lifetime, to the least, right? And so the sense was spend this capacity wisely, like spill blood if you have to. This was always considered a sin, and you would be surprised by reading the early medieval penitentiaries even how strongly the same warriors felt for it, because they did understand that it was something impure about that blood spilling. At the end of the day, they had failed to convince their opponents. The objective was not really killing them per se, but in strictly technical terms, even the ways this capacity was achieved by knighthood was beyond words. Like the training was so vicious and traumatic and really designed to really assert that power, even just only in deterrent force, knowing what these men were trained like, that they could always be spent for a better purpose. Despite this church's ongoing prohibitions, which proved largely ineffective anyway, and in fact they shouldn't even be considered in that sort of strictly normative, at least normatively executable fashion, even from the same, from the standpoint of those laymen that had the capacity of enforcing discipline and did find their limits to. Numerous councils were convened. Among these were the 10th General one of 1131, the ones of Rheims in 1148 and 1157, the Lateral Councils of 1179 and 1215, the Council of Lyon in 1245. If you know ecclesiastical history, you know that there was so much going on in these councils. The knights were not the first, knights discipline and tournament regulations weren't among the hottest topics that were very much international, about real war, about deep political issues, but these ones were important as well. In 1279, and you see how things continued, because you needed to again regulate the Christian militia in ways that would again maintain this broader purpose and specific direction. Pope Nicholas III also issued a ban on tournaments. I used to say it's ridiculous nowadays with all the things that are happening in Europe to pretend that tournaments can simply keep being held. However, the various leaders of the time were even okay with this to an extent, because they wanted themselves to pacify their kingdoms by avoiding, in fact, these bloody confrontations to routinely happen and to cause further reason for competition among their vassals and so on. But tournaments were temporarily revived twice during the reign of King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair. The first of these revivals occurred after Pope Clement V banned them on September 14, 1313. These were not particularly positive times in the relations between the papacy and the French kingdom. Not that they weren't allies on the same fronts and they, of course, backed one another internationally, but because of the sort of iron arm like struggle that was occurring in terms of who does actually own the empire between the two, because actually the empire at this point had somehow eclipsed itself. This is September 14, 1313 is just in the same days of the death of Henry VII that had descended into Italy in order to reaffirm imperial authority after generations, after the Interregnum, the rise of the Habsburg, and so on. And Philip IV is also very much like the top, like the most powerful French ruler in the Middle Ages. Really, France reaches the greatest absolute power under him. Right, his grandfather Louis IX had incarnated that sort of spiritual holiness as a lay ruler as well, as you know, and those had been probably the generations of the top chivalric, knightly, feudal culture at every level of European civilization stemming from the West. And so the idea of still holding to tournaments as a display of power, the idea that under this mega super French royal lordship, you would be able, like, its king would simply be able to handle this massive displays of power, was a great deal of that imperial scale. Now France was de facto the empire in Europe at this point. Of the display of power in absolute terms. This is interesting because Germany, for example, has sunk internationally, but the German knighthood is very well appreciated. We have made a video about the Condottieri in which we explain how exactly at this point the very veterans of Henry VII now were spreading in the thousands at the service of the Italian Ghibelline city-states service and fighting the French, in fact, of Naples, of Provence, Occitania, I would say, but still, all those who also came from across the Alps to fight in the peninsula to contend again with an imperial power and stiffen the Guelph one. And the famous Pierre Dubois, in fact, these are the great lawyers of the enormous court of Philip IV, wrote his treatise De Tournamentis et Justis, so literally about the tournament and joust, to win the favor of the same Philip in contesting the papal decree. Right. And these are very interesting sources because they tell you so much about how tournaments were properly conceived rather than also enacted. The Pope ultimately lifted the ban before Lent in 1314, also because you couldn't simply ban tournaments in a realistic way. It was just, here there is all a political background and very effective actually means to sort of annoy one another through these provisions. But it's not like it was meant forever. Again, it's not like even the myth that the papacy banned the crossbow. It's not true. Like it was referred to, let's say, the spread among the heretic groups that were at that point fighting against the same crusaders, the same knights, the same lay establishment. So we know also that later an obscure decree because we don't know actually what was written in it, by Pope John XXII, who was a guy who spent more than 1 million florins in the war against Milan. I made a video about the crusade against the Visconti reinstated tournaments at Philip's request, despite their waning popularity. And in part because if you prohibited tournaments, you also evidently sort of had a negative impact on the military quality and standard of the knights. I made a video about 14th and 15th century French army organization. We talked a bit about the crisis that France underwent during also before the 100 Years' War in terms of general collective standards, right? The French were credited with having the best cavalry in Europe. The Germans were thinking otherwise by now. But the problem wasn't much, again, even the individual province of the backbone of the average, say the smaller nobility that made up the French armies. The problem was, where would these guys train if the country now is so much regulated and hierarchical and disarmed and pacified, right? And how you standardize, especially the military performance, in order to function well, in fact, like the bigger armies. This is extremely important for the performance of the latter. Stepping a bit back in time, going back to Flanders, right? You have the period of Philip of Alsace rule between 1168 and 1191. This is an important milestone, in part a pinnacle in relative terms of tournament culture and chivalry, depending on, again, which standards you take. It's like saying, I don't know, William Marshall was the greatest knight ever. You find this cliche because somebody said that, and YouTubers copied that, but they do not understand what that even means. It's debatable to begin with. Also, for his time standards, there surely were better knights than him in Europe that also we will never know the name of. But also, what does it mean to be a better knight, right? Because knights had different roles throughout history, and aside from the strict historical documentation, you must correctly contextualize such statement. And so, Philip of Alsace is quite an interesting ruler, we will see now, because he set some also pretty brutal standards in terms of not just tournament but military culture that reflect a bit this idea of the white or the black knight, like this sort of different temperament that eventually adds into the Catholic corporatism, like to the strength of the wall coming from different seats, let's say, after the fall. Now, during this time, because you understand knights, again, would travel, especially in these much more tournament-active courts, Counts Baldwin IV and Fifth of Hainault were actively engaged in tournament battles, in fact, in the surrounding areas. So again, you have lots of courts doing practically the same and sharing this military training. A century later, Duke John I of Brabant, one of the great, most successful rulers in the region, in Lotharingia, achieved notable accomplishments that mirrored those of Philip of Alsace, the Count of Flanders. Now, Philip was known for this unique approach in tournaments and acted as a mentor to several foreign princes, including the young Henry of England. We're talking Henry II. John of Brabant trained his knights so thoroughly in martial practices that their triumph at the Battle of Waringen, we'll have to look at, is attributable to his rigorous preparation. This is true also as far as the infantry potential. The Brabantines, as you know, were among even those guys we were mentioning before. Think about Brabançon. There was a synecdoche that did stem from the presence of this Flemish infantrymen that went around as also looters, as vagabonds, sacking places, backing the local communistic instances against the clergy, the same nobility, because they knew how to take down knights. there would be all set of experiments even before Kortrijk regarding the Flemish military in that task. Let's put it in this way. Think about the bloody resistance to the death of the Flemish infantry at Bouvines. Both princes exemplified the chivalric ideas of their time. At Philip of Alsace's court, for example, poets such as Chrétien de Troyes, Gautier de Pinal, so the pinnacles of the ultra-elite and cultural superiority of Western civilization in chivalric epos, as well as the unnamed fact author of Les Proverbes aux Vilains, thrived. I made some videos about medieval literature. I'm not a historian of literature, but of course, as a historian, I must pick everything. I made a video about cliché, in fact, about tournaments. You will see it here, among the linked videos and the related video suggestions, by Chrétien de Troyes, right? We'll have to make much more of that. Duke John of Brabant instead supported the poet Adené Leroy and earned accolades from Jan van Eylu, and he himself occasionally wrote poetry. There was still this ideal of the warrior bard that is very much alive, for example, still among the German Minnesänger, that are a bit more, again, primitively flavored, and so you have also in general from a biological standpoint, the peak of male creativity is the peak of male crime, and so these people had sort of the top artistic and poetic sensitivity. They were incredibly open-minded people, next to their conscientiousness, but also very low agreeableness at times and subversion, and they would again be capable of so much beauty and love, and of course slaughtering large amounts of human beings without blinking. And this is really interesting because when you look at knightly psychology, you realize that much more than you think is going on beyond the face, like of the knight itself. And we'll have to talk about this knightly psychology because it, from a strictly psychiatric point of view, it's one of the single most fascinating things you can ever imagine, but also traumatic for you just to know what they went through. You can imagine for them literally being to that. Now, Philip of Alsace had also had all a great military curriculum. We were talking about top knightly chivalric culture. He participated, for example, in 2 crusades. He also participated to an expedition against Milan, leading his own troops from north of the Alps to the Lombard city, where at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, that he participated in his army as an imperial vassal. John of Brabant undertook 2 campaigns in Spain. Think about this, because there were lots of Westerners who would go fight and die in the Reconquista, but we're talking also these top figures, right? Others would prefer, like especially the Germans, to go to the Baltic. John also traveled to England for tournaments, because really the Arthurian culture and more would attract so many people to Britain that since antiquity, as you know, was considered this land of magic, of arcane wisdoms. It was a bit of a fairy tale place, and at least Brabant is close as the crow flies, more than Spain. Even Philip's life ended, by the way, tragically, as it often happened to many, even rulers of the time, thinking about the aforementioned Louis IX, due to a widespread epidemic. This occurred in Outremer, near Acre, whereas John of Brabant died from complications following a minor Justin wound. There weren't so many ways at the time to combat infections and gangrene. That's how the same Richard Lionheart died during a siege, as you know, for a crossbow bolt. Remember that the ultimate aim of every knight is chasing the Imperium, right, and achieving it. So people often think that, these lords were not trying to do exactly what Rome did. I think the Middle Ages is another era. It's nothing to just to realize what that is. If you're interested, you can also watch that video about the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle, which explains a little bit how eventually Latin Germanic feudalism sort of manifested in also terms of individual value of the knight and how was that built. And there were, as we were saying before, like different ways, different paths to that. For example, Philip of Alsace's tournament methods were often criticized for lacking chivalric integrity. That's also a point. Like, who does establish that, right? Is it full manifestation of power or what? Regardless, in fact, the knights accepted such methods, let's put it in this way. They recognized essentially Philip's belief in using any means necessary against an opponent. This is relevant because when you read the contemporary chivalric literature, the epos of the time, you realize that eventually, like this established a canon of some sort, regardless of course, like the origins of these texts lost in the mists of history. When also different values had existed, like by degree. There is an idea of chivalry that we have today on the basis of this. It's not like these knights did not recognize them. As we observed, these did compose these poems themselves, new ones as well. But there was a phase of war that was inherently different, and that was notoriously different, but not in the sense of, war is hell, simply like in the sense of, oh my god, how war is bad. No, these people loved war. And they did so in the sense that they really knew how it was handled, and they found their own personal accomplishment in the same, as we were hinting at before. So that when you have to win, you have to win. And whenever you find knights rarely writing in sort of more prosaic terms about war, you realize that they're not really hinting at a type of war that is ideally regulated. Right, certain things would have been completely normal. For example, the idea of not using missile weapons, especially at this time when the javelin had fundamentally been abandoned. It was still around at the beginning, at the time of Hastings, as you know. But having a crossbow as a sidearm would have been a sort of much more straightforwardly normal thing that we normally believe about. Say a 12th century knight or a 13th century knight. It's just the sources do not even feel the need just to say that, right? We remember always that provisional, these positive sources are very different from like a reality in the normality of warfare, right? We know that knights fought topping every kind of weapon usage compared to any other fighter, right? So this was obviously achieved through selective training for all the weapons available, because they were to be used as well. Speaking of methods, John of Brabant was more straightforward. He preferred to resolve the battle at Waringen through straightforward combat rather than through trenches, opting to dismantle bandit strongholds over engaging in large but fruitless expeditions to the Holy Land as well. We will look more at the context of Waringen because it's one of the most famous battles of the era. There's a very interesting connection between cavalry and infantry, though, that shouldn't be dismissed also in this sort of doctrinal devil. Doctrinal is a bit an anachronistic term, but still. Due to the influential examples set by various princes, tournaments thrived in areas like southern Netherlands, Lorraine, and Flanders, in part also because these were less regulated centers to begin with. Like if you really wanted to go at war rather than just a tournament, like there was always plenty of wars all around among the various very bitter feudal disputes, and there wasn't like an overlord that could simply say, okay, let's quit with this. No, it's a way to go where things are a bit less regulated so that you can circumvent your own country's restrictions, right? So it's quite interesting also from a cultural point of view. And as we've seen before, for the French case, still most important tournaments would, however, be and primarily hosted in France, right? France still couldn't do without its knightly chivalric culture, so it sort of made a great effort, a great investment also to stage this massive tournaments and having the capacity to regulate them, not make them escalate into major brawls that would destroy like the very places where these activities were held. France's prominence in this area was so historical and significant that the English chronicle Ralph Diceto labeled these events as literally Conflictus Gallici, so really like a type of French war, while Ralph of Coggeshall referred to them as battle, struggle, more francorum, so of the sort of Frankish kind. This is important because we said before that between the Arthurian legions and this newly, formed vassalitic culture in the Anglo-Norman period, England would in fact foster some of the highest pinnacles of feudal and even tournament culture. Think about the Knights of the Round Table, like what that entailed in a participative way. Like consider that the epics produced in these places from the Arthurian Legion, the Germanic Legion, is shared all across Europe, right? The Germans, the Italians read French literature like crazy, for example. They have also their own model, as we've seen, of re-elaboration of the same. And they are very much like all their elites, like as post-Carolingian kingdoms, are actually mirroring that. And they have held a knightly culture themselves. However, France had been literally the model. The spring from everything had been born. I can argue that since Merovingian times, the tendency of this elite that controlled literally everything to foster its own military legitimization in their own through military quality had done nothing but increasing. France was a bigger system. It had a greater discipline, like through this massive monarchy, and so the French knights also had been the most abundantly endowed with resources in order to, especially during the great expansion of France during the 12th to 13th century, to prove their own superiority over the others. Several English monarchs, including Henry II, that was yet another great knight, all kings telling the truth were, but expected at least to be, right? They had a military lifestyle, but these were also pretty darn good warriors. Instituted bans on tournaments because of the political unrest they often generated, showing how difficult it was. In fact, in England, that, as you know, had been and would be torn apart by ferocious civil strifes during the 12th to 13th century, could not simply afford the same level of tournament staging as France. Right? It was a smaller system, in a sense a tidier one, but one that could be at times more easily disrupted at the roots, like in the heart of the same country. However, during the turbulent civil war of King Stephen's ineffective reign, and exactly to reinforce the previous concept of strong monarchy equates sort of not many tournaments, or at least more regulated ones, tournaments experienced a surge in popularity in England, right? So monarchy is weak, as we've seen, like in Flanders, for example, where technically there isn't even a monarchy on the horizon. It's technically either in part Flanders, in part French Flanders, and the rest is basically the Holy Roman Empire. You have like barons doing essentially whatever they want, or almost at least, because they have in part on a smaller scale the same issues. Later, Richard Lionheart, another great champion of chivalry in the annals of medieval warfare, recognized that French knights were better trained than his own, and permitted knightly exercises at the same time to also kind of gap that difference, right? So we're talking here about like the average, right? Of course, Richard was much better than the average French or English knight. He is, again, one of the great heroes of the Crusades, one of the greatest monarchs, at least for his military performance in Europe at the time. I mean, the way he handled the Battle of Arsuf is amazing, also including like the general control over the army, the other noblemen, the infantry, combined arm tactics. But even the Muslims said this guy is too courageous, like he exposes himself more than what his his position would suggest to be wise. And in fact, that's how he died, plunging also the country in further issues historically. So this was a time of change, a time of much needed regulation as well, that these kingdoms were starting to impose in parallel to this kind of individual exploit. The Lionheart's effective leadership enabled him to swiftly reclaim lost territories, instilling such confidence in his troops that, according to the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, so the history of St. William Marshal, that had much to do with him, with his father, also especially from a knightly, from a military point of view, they audaciously faced 40 French knights with only 30 of their own, which frankly is not this huge divide, telling the truth. Apparently a bold maneuver that was unprecedented. I have my own reserves on this. I mean, while it is true that 30 or 40 knights by the time of Richard Lionheart were really a robust unit, right, to some degree, battles were hardly like in the thousands of knights, especially to the limited effect that, especially crossing into France from England, or at least even gathering forces in a relatively scattered territory like the one of the Angevin Empire, would be able to be fielded. You can even argue that France and England were so similar at this point in military culture that this warfare was so symmetric that even a 3-4 would seem like too bold, right? But there are many battles in which, in fact, the divide is bigger, and especially at this relatively small unit military scale, it's actually relatively easy to procure some pretty bizarre outcomes, like even a guy defeating 10 or things like this. So from one side, you can read this as there was such a foundationally expensive and rigid technicality about knightly warfare at this point that even, again, 3-4 was considered as unusual, at least. From the other, you can argue that this was still the age in which pretty impressive individual feats could be achieved. But there was a lot of caution as well. So this is also in part the reason why, as we've seen how much a knight cost, and that must not, I mean, Richard knew better because he worked as credit card basically across Europe, as he was, as you know, made prisoner by Leopold of Austria on his way back from the Crusades, where he had heavily insulted the German noblemen. So made a video about Conrad of Montferrat if you're interested in Richard's feuds and at Similia. I like to expand a bit into this world because you can still almost like pick individual knights, and yes, you can argue that this is the golden age of knighthood, but again, it depends really on the various generations, because you can argue from a technical point of view the greatest power of cavalry, in relative terms was the mid 13th century. Then these previous times were more about individual champion kind of performance. I made a video about Henry I, militaries, like the royal household fundamentally. So it really depends. Philip Augustus, as you know, a contemporary of Richard, Leonard and his siblings, unfortunately encountered this English audacity first hand at Reuteval. We'll have to talk about these clashes. We are on July the 13th, 1194. Also at Gisors on September the 28th, 1198. In the life of Edward I, that I made an entire series on recently, it's noted that foreign tournaments in England became the testing ground for a great king during the years 1260-1262. Tournaments closely mirrored actual battlefield encounters. This is perhaps the aspect we tend to underestimate the most. Some sources even describe the charge of knights as tornatio, this tournoiement, which means to turn, because that's literally what everybody fights like, right? The poses between combat, the sort of going back and forth. It's also what animals do when they fight, right? I always say that with my cat, I experienced that. Like you play with him, he gets heated and needs to breathe more, and so he will try to escape the clash, but he will run at the bottom from the other side of the room, and he will then point you and relax a little, prepare and discharge and charge again. That's exactly how any animal really fights, and that's how humans really fight. Knights fought using their standard armaments, as we've seen, so there was much about this, parity in technical terms that had to be surpassed by individual and collective prowess, especially in mobility. That was really the big deal, like knowing how to charge, maintaining cohesion during the fight, and then retreating in an orderly fashion without losing too many men, and then reforming somewhere else and recharging. It takes a hell of a collective training. And what is interesting is that I made different videos about the battles of the era. Bouvines may be the peak of this specific generation's sort of way of fighting, including with flank attacks, which had always been a thing, telling the truth, but they sort of become a bit more prominent in the 13th century. And you never have to underestimate how, again, how fluid these formations were and how agile they needed to be in order to reform in these ways. Later on, this will be practically impossible. Armies will be too big. I mean, there would be multiple charges, etc., but at sort of smaller unit tactics level, because normally it's this major charge between major battle lines of even more than 1,000 knights that will make the thing. And at that point, we don't even have sort of specific accounts telling us what happened in the fray, because it was all more about the bigger formation that this individual exploit. Knights were even heavier, and they couldn't simply come back and reform, right? Instead, in this era, they sort of could. And so this back and forth was very, very well, it had really an enormous emphasis. And it sort of is the measure of how qualitative cavalry is, right? Because some units just do not have the necessary training and stamina just to reform and be able to lead a cavalry charge that, as we know, must be something extremely orderly and compact. You can't just sort of run at the enemy in broken formation, more or less. There are some situations in which you can do that, even with some success, but the idea is that this knightly warfare has become so heavily regulated, homogeneous, standardized, compact, that it's becoming even sort of less wieldy. By the way, there is ever more infantry power as well. And so that increases, if anything, the performance of combined arms tactics of just cavalry that obviously had never been fighting alone in all this. And this knightly culture often overlooks in the sources what the infantry did, which was, however, very important. I mean, still up to the mid-12th century, as we know, cavalry was not fully decisive. There are instances of infantry, including the same dismounted knights, managing to actually stop enemy cavalry. After that, like up to the beginning of the 14th century, cavalry dominates Western European battlefields, right? Maybe not in the fringe, but not because the fringe is military superior, but because it's inferior. In fact, nobody has really any interest to go there to sustain an army there, because there are much better places where to fight, and the peoples there are not even threatening to begin with. And so, even when you look, for example, at the modifications of knightly weapons, you realize that even during the tournaments, this did not really change much. Like lances and sword edges remained unaltered. I mean, there was no reason to modify the panoply, unlike it would occur in the later Middle Ages, to decrease lethality of the combat. There was no need for such adjustments, say, between the mid-12th and mid-13th century, in part because the knight defensive armor was sufficiently strong to reduce the risk of fatal injuries, but because actually the latter weren't even this enormous deal, right? The sense is that, again, you can easily smash into one another at enormous speed and killing yourself just by falling off from horseback, right? Just that only is causing a lot of dead, right? For not talking about the possibility of sustaining serious injuries. So the myth that these knights were simply like fighting without dying, also in battles, because they sort of preferred to ransom themselves as prisoners, is complete BS, right? You know, if you look at the losses of these battles, you realize that they were pretty heavy also among the knights, and that there is no evidence whatsoever that, aside from this practice of ransoming the prisoners and so on, this affected more than much the actual lethality of combat. And by the way, you know, it has nothing to do with a panoply, right? If you die, you die because somebody kills you, like, or you die yourself of exhaustion, literally during combat. It happened all the time, and you would have also infantrymen not being so nice towards knights. Just during major military operations, during the break of a battle, like, people die, regardless of who they are, what they wear. Without mentioning that in order to get the hell out of the way, they would often also throw away part of their armor. So it's complicated, right? Remember the Saint King of France, Philip II Augustus, being pulled by enemy harpoons at the Battle of Bouvines, but while being dragged from the other side by his own bodyguard on foot, right? This is very interesting. And so, while it's true that the risk was not considerably higher than in real battles during that period, never think that battles were bloodless for the knights, right? Fatalities were relatively low than, let's say, compared to cheaper types of troopers. This is true. But if you consider the unit casualties, these were very high in absolute terms. Especially considering also the cost for the general system, as we were discussing it before, to sustain it, to supply the field. It was a total disaster even to lose a few knights in principle, also for the rest of the army. So a primary distinction between tournaments and actual battles was the predetermined terrain for the engagements. At least this is a cliche, because this would happen also in actual battles, and it would be even more frequent, especially as we were pointing out before, like, armies became ever more unwieldy, right? And so at a point, even the strategic balance between the two armies could be played on the type of ground, say preparation and tactical insight in the days up to the battle, in which there would be skirmishes and all, but that really were necessary as a time lapse for the armies to actually even just settle there and prepare for battle. This is absolutely the case, especially for the 13th century. We have seen other battles, like the one of Buchterhuld, for example, in which the general, like, there could be like random engagements in the midst of somewhere, knowing of course that the enemy armies were around, but not knowing exactly where you would have met them. And so there were also different units, different divisions, detachments, so it would be different combats at different times. And this is partly true for the tournaments as well, right? So knights did travel considerable distances, often in the company of friends or led by their lords. Each knightly group would designate its own ground for the tournament, that at least allowed more easily for that marked area from which they would charge during the tournament. And this could be done because, of course, during tournaments normally there wasn't the same political strategic push in order to be at each other's throats. But again, it's not that dramatically different from actual warfare too. And so you can expect in battle the same thing to have really just happened, right? So you can't give to somebody an appointment also on battlegrounds that had already been chosen, so you would know the same how the terrain would be. And so it's all relative whether these battles were actually different from tournaments and vice versa. The designated area also functioned as a refuge for those who required a respite, a notable contrast to genuine warfare, which was actually the case. So then in this sense, yes, it was a regulating discipline, remember, concerning like the tournament of times. Another significant difference lay in the tradition of laying down arms once one side conceded defeat, right? However, if the opposing side did not fully surrender and began to retreat, the chase would continue. So this is also pretty much like real battles, because why would you have to stop it? Because you see, this was replicating the same identical strategic balance that existed in combat. Why would you refrain from capturing an enemy that is broken and that has declared that just because, I don't know, somebody decided before that? Like, would you do that in a battle? Would you let the opportunity to kidnap one of them, like so, without any reason? Of course, again, this depended largely on the politics behind that. If people in front of you were sort of your friends, you were not really fighting a war with them, of course, you would be nice with them. But again, don't think that this 11th, 12th century tournaments were that different from warfare also, as you know, the Clausewitzian instrument of politics, because those rivalries really never ended anywhere. A mutual armistice could also be arranged, typically lasting until hostilities resumed the following day, because these were also multiple days combats. That's not quite like battles, normally, at least the main engagements. Here if the thing was enough regulated, they would all reform, right? You don't have major battles like one fight one day and then continuing the other day, unless it's literally an entirely prolonged thing, but at that point it's mostly like in siege warfare or something. You can have different clashes leading up to the battle on multiple days, but in real warfare, the culminating clash, the climax of the campaign, really brings to normally like a neatly settled outcome. At the conclusion of the tournament, a prize would be awarded to the knight who excelled in bravery or skill in unhorsing captured opponents. This was very important because you can imagine all the prizes and badges that you would have won as a knight of clear fame. And remember, these men are doing both tournaments and war at the same time. Remember, before even the tournaments staged during the same battles, like they happen. And so people would remember, and there would be an increasingly sort of fixed way of determining who was who had done. Like, think about how what would become literal heraldry started in this. Also, tournament practice as well, the sense of the arms to be so the alter ego of the warrior, together with the dame and the horse, and the helm, the crest, symbolizing the house of the guy. So that's more like later medieval, but the concept is always there in traditional principle. You just have to sort of unwind that back in time. Now, the tournament battles unfolded normally on flat, unmarked terrain. This was actually the case of major battles because, again, knights needed favorable terrain to fight in. And simply from a strategic and logistical point of view, you don't fight in a place that is, on a terrain that is tough for you. Like, big armies need to just go along valleys to be well watered, well supplied. So again, this is normally the flatlands, the valley, not a more difficult terrain. Different stories for siege warfare, which was also reenacted in tournaments. However, generally speaking, that of course did not entail major open field confrontations. Now, each faction would emerge from its base and charge at the adversary, with knights fighting in groups that varied in size depending on the participation of local nobility as well. But normally there was, of course, like the same organic of the military. These guys were the military, and so it was normal for medieval armies to be coalition forces on a regular basis. And so the idea is that people would join, and battle lines, single units, making it up, were agglutinated ad hoc on the same day of battle. Naturally, this would preferably follow a general order. Like, you would fight more or less with your own retinues, with, say, your own relatives, people you knew, with your lord. That was obvious. That was reflected in the same organization and hierarchy of command. But you could be grouped together with other people that you had never met before, except differently from other times in history. This cavalry was professional and experienced enough to simply be able to fight alongside with these guys. Of course, if you didn't know them, there was a minus in morale or something, but in general, everybody knew how to fight like that. Also, XI-XIII, it was a way to bond, again, to forge relations, to in-depth or to credit yourself to someone, etc. Like, somebody may save your life and vice versa. So that's important in combat. Again, these battles were pretty real deals. As we'll see now, there were also infantrymen in these clashes. It wasn't like a joke, right? Things were rough. The forces involved in mounted warfare are often deadly, even if you don't want to kill. So there is nothing really to joke about this all. Typically, knights from Flanders and Hainaut would band together to battle against the French in France. And that sort of makes sense. I mean, you want to categorize on the basis of distinct groups, mirroring also these enhanced feudal hierarchies that are molding the various principalities of Europe, because that's how they would fight against one another in other circumstances. Like, think about the Battle of Bouvines. It was viewed as scandalous when Baldwin of Hainaut, recently knighted and later to become Count Baldwin V, we remembered before, being very active in these tournaments, fought on the French side against the Flemish during a tournament near Gournay and Resson instead of cooperating with the customary alliance of Hainaut, Flanders, and Vermandois against the French. This is relevant because it also shows a bit how different the geography of the system really was. I mean, Vermandois was to remain technically French in concept, and the Flemish would, again, these were boundaries areas, border areas, but at large you could have the strange alignments that were considered to be. But what do? Do you fight with the other guys? Because this would, again, cause damage. Monetary, well, it would have a real cost. That was a way, again, to forge alliances, to show yourself more inclined to fight for a certain lord rather than another, and so on. In their respective regions, Flemings would face Hainaulters and vice versa, with Brabanters also confronting Hainaulters. They pretty much all hated each other in the pictures, especially in the lowlands. Like Lotharingia had this quite sort of brutal rivalry within these groups. Brabant would emerge victorious among these all in general, but they were the better ones. I made a video about medieval Brabant. If you're interested, you can check that out. We have to make a note because that's really relevant. So just like in actual combat, tournaments helped cultivate local pride and enhance moral unity within military ranks, also on this national basis. The knights were organized into convois. Famously enough, these were units of varying strengths, but mostly like in, it depends, like the basic units, as we were saying before, were 30, 40 men. Then battle lines could be the hundreds of knights, and the sense was sticking together at all costs, right? Maintaining alignment, cohesion, right? And this depended also naturally on the power of the lord that disposed of these knights, the involvement of local nobility. Again, also the organics could vary, but normally, like, it was just depending on how much a lord would control, not how much the functionality of the various units would work. Normally, they were standardized. We will see this better in other videos about organics specifically. Now, these formations were compact, to say the least, with horsemen aligned side by side. You know the story that said if they had thrown an apple in between, like, it would have not fallen because of how thickly packed these guys really were. It was difficult, right, to maintain that cohesion during the charge, and that was basically what this was all about. So they were required to advance and charge in a coordinated manner. I want to make more videos about how cavalry charges were actually made, because the various ranks all had a specific function during the charge. It was actually the first one only to charge in the last meters, the others slowing down, capitalizing the psychological effect and the gaps opened by the guys of the first ranks, and then entering to those in case of need. Naturally, things could get very messy, and you needed to extricate yourself from the melee, because that was exhausting and dangerous, because you were potentially breaking the formation. So such organized tactics were so advantageous that they could transform a disadvantageous strength ratio into a favorable one. During a tournament, the knightly forces of Prince Henry, that is the son of Henry II of England, this guy would die before his siblings, clashed with the French knights, who, overconfident due to their numerical advantage, broke formation out of sheer bravado. Right, and so this is interesting as well, because it shows you that the confidence of saying, well, we are so many, like, we can actually even split. It's not a big deal. But this shows you how actually risky it was, because the disarray led to a crushing defeat for them. And so the English won. And so it was considered one of the most significant mistakes a knight could make to charge individually, especially like breaking away from the protective ranks of the convoi which jeopardized unit cohesion. If you were not a team player, you were doomed here. Like the Rotmeister at the head of the convoy would literally ride ahead a little bit and check everybody who was aligned, shouting at this or that guy if they weren't. But the main problem was not even the technique, because these guys were well drilled. Like maybe just the youngsters especially would need more practice, but it was primarily either a military or psychological choice, right? Some fighters would, like in this case, decide to break the line because they felt cocky enough to say, okay, we can exhibit ourselves and ride ahead. You could be put to death in theory, like if you charged before, especially the leader. Remember what Tacitus says about the Germanic comitatus, the fact that every fighter didn't have to be less than the leader in combat. And this equates immediately to they could be the next leader if they're just a bit better than him, even. And so it is found notoriously at this point during major engagements. We talked before about Arsuf, which required a very cold, rational calculation of when to charge, with coup d'oeil, like in a cold blood. And Richard Lionheart was the best for this because he was very sort of peaky and cold, and he knew how to maintain control in this. Like wasn't Lionheart just because he was so bold. He knew his deal as a knight. I don't remember the point, but oh yes, this was a choice. But the other issue could be people get nervous, especially the young or green troops that need to vent their adrenaline by actually charging straight into the enemy without maintaining alignment. Basically, like full gallop was never achieved during charges, if not like in the last 100 meters where you knew that you could, gain momentum without breaking excessively the formation. But for example, the aforementioned Battle of Zunta, why do the Carolingians lose against the Saxon infantrymen, by the way? Because these were fresh recruits from the Rhineland, and they were not experienced enough, so they freak out, and instead of, paradoxically, like you would think, they would try to preserve their lives, not to charge so eagerly. Instead, they actually let their reins loose, and they lose cohesion, and the cavalry charge is destroyed. And so, in contrast, attacking in close formation reduces the risk of the enemy breaching their lines. So considering that they are doing both the same things, because again, especially from the mid-12th century onwards, you have essentially just cavalry confrontations. Yes, you can have in sieges like knights dismounting, being stormtroopers of the situation. They always do that throughout all the Middle Ages. But in open field, it's primarily cavalry against cavalry. And if the enemy, like if you have to, like at Bouvines, like you have to take down these fanatics, like the Brabançons that will have themselves exterminated rather than surrendering you need to charge against this infantryman, also losing some knight. But primarily when you destroy the enemy cavalry, basically the enemy army gives way at this point, and it's increasingly the case. The aforementioned Philip of Alsace, highlighted in the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, was one of the greatest knights of his times, regardless of his sort of dark military theory. And in fact, he was considered also one of the most courteous Count of Flanders, because courtliness here has to do with essentially the generosity that you show as a redistributor of wealth, as a military leader, so that your men can be tough and compact and strengthening that cohesion, so that you will not just treasure some riches without spending them into the actual imperium. So that was very, very important. And so Philip employs, also for this reason, shrewd strategies in tournaments, firmly believing that any tactics were permissible against the adversary. And it was really a matter of traditional wisdom in here, because again, how do you actually set what is loyal or unloyal when let's say, you're fighting, and so basically whoever wins is because has received God's imperium. Right? There is always a sin, a fault in loss, in defeat. However it goes, it's always your own fault. Even if it's the enemy's fault that has defeated you, but it's still both at the same time. And people have enormous problems to understand this, because today, and that's why we live in an anti-traditional world, if something happens to someone, it's just, this is a human, earthly standard, like it's the guy who did that wrong, right? In those times, it didn't work like this at all. Everybody was recognized to be responsible, even for the things that happened to them, while those who did it to them were responsible at the same time, in the same way. That's a very strong moral and scientific conception. And of course, this reflects a continuity in tactical approaches among counts regarding tournaments, with the nightly exercises of princes directly shaping military strategies. Think about flank attack and how famous that would be, especially in the 13th century, which is the peak of all these tactics. It's almost as if everybody had always tried to use the tactics, and we know of it only when it succeeded. I'm writing an article about this, because how likely can it be that only when we know of this tactic only when it succeeded? In my opinion, there was always the other side trying to do the same, but failing, because it was actually a very difficult tactic to actually enact, if anything, because the enemy could spot it in advance. And I discussed this also in the flanking maneuvers in commenting von Clausewitz, von Kriege. Philip of Alsace often incorporated strong contingents that included well-armed foot soldiers, which already shows you how this military wisdom passed through combined arms. And so if a guy like Philip was using foot soldiers, it was not just because he was playing unfairly. He was playing good, because he understood how strategic, for example, concealing infantry during tournaments could create the illusion of excluding them from the fray. And there is some interesting hint of the position of these guys pretty early on, in fact, in Philip's times, regarding the deployment of infantry on the wings. That is something that it's difficult to find before the 13th century, and in particular, like the late 13th, especially in the Italian armies, that had a lot of infantry. So a good one, you can see it much better documented for many reasons. But this is the same age of Richard Lionheart that, after all, used those same Italians as missile troops successfully, so against the Turco-Egyptian infantry at Arsuf in combined arms with the knights. And so the question there is, isn't it obviously functional that these foot soldiers have to be deployed on the flanks, to have them always in the front line with the knights and supporting them from the side, to fall on the enemy flanks? We're told that Philip of Alsace awaited the perfect moment while cavalry units engaged, and signaled a charge, striking the enemy's flank when they were fatigued and their formations disintegrated. And I don't think it's even about that. If he did so, it's difficult to conceal infantry in a tournament or in other operations. Technically, the cavalry can move away, but the sense if here is that if you already deploy these guys on the flanks, and there are other guys from the side that will counter them, you can sort of outflank the enemy if these prevail on the others. And so obliging also the enemy to follow your own tactic during tournaments if they want to cope with you. And he was better at it, apparently. Right? This tactic resulted, in fact, in Philip's victory and significant rewards for his knights, regardless of the fact that it had been achieved with footmen as well. Prince Henry's tutor, as we remembered before, Philip shared these tactics, initially making the prince pay a high price for this insight in an actual tournament. The Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal details how the knights advanced in a tightly packed convoi without disorder, formed in close battle order, and fought in dense ranks. In doing so, they ensured that no enemy could break through their lines, unlike units that moved chaotically, where knights recklessly abandoned formation to fight directly, drawing harsh criticism for their actions. You were not a good knight if you weren't able to remain in formation. This, of course, demonstrates the existence of authentic tactical formations, with the fact that all this warfare was very well standardized, and I don't know. For example, Delbruck believed that knights clashes degenerated into melees on a regular basis. There was ever very individualistic clash. It's not really true. Right, or at least if it is the case, that's not a good situation you find yourself in, and you're prone to lose. So obviously, the emphasis was towards this kind of discipline that as we know, had always existed in every army. So it's not like the medieval ones are an exception, or especially they're less than the ones of other times. On the contrary, sometimes they had actually much greater collective training in than ancient or modern armies, but people do not seem to realize this. Philip Valses capitalized on moments when the contestants were no longer arrayed in structured ranks and had become disjointed as a unit. And of course, you had to be able to achieve that to begin with. He would then launch these flank attacks, particularly exploiting the mistakes of those knights who had deviated from their formations. And it's not easy to do that as well. I mean, it's not like cheating, it's mostly like in line of principle, dishonorable if you're not allegedly giving the individual the chance to confront frontally, especially, and so that's mostly the issue drawing from it. But if this is done under your command and there are some knights of lower ranks that are going to, for example, perform the flank attack because they don't care so much about their own honor, it's not really your fault, you see. You may have planned that, you may have ordered them to do so, but you technically didn't fight in that way, and that's where the sort of dichotomy collective individual comes into play, because it's really about the wall. It's not much about the individual that matters when you want to win this larger engagement in such an advanced art of war by now. And so there were many people indeed that were disoriented and shocked by this as well. But it was also the temper of the times, and warfare passed through this collective arrangement. It was all about that. It's always been about that. And so heroic warfare, technically, in historical times, never really happened. It's just a myth, right? There would always be someone fighting with a hero, having this sort of means to outflank the enemy as well with lighter troops, or with smaller contingents, like also for elite troops like cavalry. At some point we will talk more and better about cavalry tactics, because flank attacks in specifically, because we made lots of videos about, for example, the Battle of Tagliacozzo, etc. Like, we've seen how important flank attacks were to determine battles, but it's not like, okay, the narrative may be, those who used this were cheating. No, they weren't. You don't do that so easily. You don't have to be spotted. It has to be like a few troops that you must use just specifically well at the right moment. It takes enormous equestrian skills. Enormous. It may be actually the most difficult thing to do in the first place. So chapeau to all those who actually did that. So when the young English Prince Henry's troops were in disarray and his men weary, the Count Philip of Alsace initiated his onslaught. And two scholars analyzing the text referring to this argue that Henry's knights may have been just exhausted, and so when they faced with this fresh Flemish forces, they simply couldn't react. It's both at the same time. Likely this is not now the main issue, but we're talking about a type of military school that these people would not forget in their lives, right? And so when you look at such great tournaments, and that's where you see that young Prince Henry will be able to apply essentially the same lessons against the French. Like, you realize how intertwined all these military experiences really were, and how crucial they were for developing really that sense, the sheer sense of a military culture that could be reliable for war as well. Because in war, these things would happen even more frequently, as a matter of fact. So it was a training ground where you had to be able to master this tactic without essentially any impediment. And that's difficult. You don't just do that, right? It's a problem. Only the best knights that really have trained so much, in part thanks to the training. Remember, why does Philip have all this experience, for example? Like, he does from war, which is truly the most important part of the story, also against the Saracens, against different enemies that do different things. But especially he also trains. He's able to replicate these tactics in multiple engagements, including the tournaments. And so it's this experience more than else. Many people think that these tactics, especially the flank attack or the feigned flight, were, stuff copied from the Saracens. No, these things had always existed, and now they were just being perfected because there was a much more intense way of war, and just going to fight in the Holy Land, regardless of the enemy would just put yourself into a condition whereby you have such an enormous military experience, where all the things that happen to you, the organization of it all, the motivation, the capacity to endure any kind of issue, that automatically confers you like such a great military capacity, at least within like your own potential, which is also an important part of the story. But these men literally spent their entire life on horseback, training, fighting, practicing all these tactics, and that's how gradually this way of war is forming, and it's never stopping. Like, there is not a definitive point of arrival. There is always, of course, a counter force that you must cope with, and so it's incredibly important to be able to picture this military scale of tournaments as well, military dimension of tournaments, how they would affect real warfare, because as we've seen, in part they were the same thing, but in part they were really designed for the same more conventional warfare. It's really the expression of the same military culture. And so if you want to understand warfare at the time, you can't avoid to learn the specific things about tournaments. I have something else in common on tournaments in a completely random way. I like it when the cycle provides us with strange compactions of similar topics in given time. It does sort of mark different eras on the channel, but as you know, we come back on topics like these regularly for obvious reasons, and we will have to do this ever more. Now, I'm glad we covered this, and I hope we'll do really similar stuff soon. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.